Last night was the 52nd consecutive night of violent activity in downtown Portland targeting federal facilities and federal properties, mainly the Mark Hatfield Federal Courthouse. Let me reiterate that the department fully supports those who wish to peacefully protest. Let me say this again, we support and we will protect those who want to peacefully protest. Unfortunately, what we are seeing in Portland every night, roughly from midnight to 4:30 or 5 a.m., is the complete opposite. Again, what is occurring in Portland in the early hours of every morning is not peaceful protesting. These individuals are organized and they have one mission in mind: to burn down or to cause extreme damage to the federal courthouse and to law enforcement officers. At times, we also see them targeting city property. These individuals congregate in the same area night after night. We see them planning their attacks. These individuals carry lasers, baseball bats, explosive fireworks, metal pipes, glass bottles, accelerants, and other weapons, all targeting federal facilities and federal law enforcement. On July 3rd, before any surge of DHS law enforcement resources arrived in Portland, the mayor said the violence, and I quote, has been going on for more than a month now. Groups continue to target the Justice Center. They continue to hurt small businesses, and these attacks undermine public safety. These words are true today as they were before DHS law enforcement arrived in the city of Portland. My message is very simple. If you're looking to peacefully protest in Portland, the department respects your right to do so. Please do so away from the violent activity that's taking place near the courthouse on a nightly basis for your own safety. If you are a violent rioter looking to inflict damage to federal property or law enforcement officers, you need to find another line of work.
But last night at midnight, violent demonstrators blocked the streets around the Hatfield Courthouse, the Justice Center we mentioned earlier, and the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt Federal Building. So the streets were blocked. At 12:55 a.m., we observed someone taking pictures of the water intake system at the Edith Green Federal Building. Later that night, a Twitter user tweeted, "So we can now shut off the water to the buildings the feds are staying in to make it a nightmare for them." At 3:29 this morning, the protesters smashed the glass of the courthouse with a fire extinguisher and attempted to throw commercial-grade fireworks inside the courthouse through the broken glass. Once again, our teams went outside to push them away from the front of the Hatfield Courthouse. The teams faced significant resistance from the crowds. Fireworks and glass bottles were thrown at the officers, and protesters attempted to light a tree on fire directly in front of the Hatfield Courthouse.
We're not going to allow somebody to walk up to the federal property, assault a federal officer or agent, and because then they walk off federal property, then we're going to say, oh, we can't go arrest you. Well, that doesn't make sense. Of course we're going to arrest you, and we have the authority to make that arrest. I'd like to address two other persistent questions that come up. First, unmarked vehicles. Look, I've been in law enforcement for almost 3 decades. The use of unmarked vehicles is a standard procedure, a standard practice among every local, state, and federal law enforcement agency in this country, actually in the world. It's nothing new. But it's especially important under these circumstances. Every one of us known, every one of us in the past few weeks has seen what have they been doing. I call these individuals criminals, not the peaceful protesters, but the individuals, again, with intent that are going to go out and actually target marked vehicles. We've seen it time and time again.
They said on the news that they will not come out and shoot us with rubber bullets and tear gas us if we cannot breach this or throw the bombs or whatever. If they do that, I'll move our fuck out the way and I'll help you go in. But if they don't, they held their word. And we still get to hear our voices be heard. People out here, because I'm sick of y'all getting tear gas. And I'm sick of y'all getting shot, especially the people who didn't do absolutely nothing.
You're not listening.
Protesters advanced towards, engaged the officers again, throwing water bottles and other hard objects, fireworks, and using lasers. We had talked about, you've seen the green lasers that are being used out there. We have 3 officers who currently have eye injuries, and they may not recover sight in those eyes from those laser attacks, and they may not recover sight in those eyes, and they may not recover sight in those eyes.
I'm going to show you guys quickly how to burn stuff with the laser. Make sure you have your safety glasses on, and actually the perfect item to test out the burning feature on is the charger itself, because it's made out of a very cheap black plastic. What you're going to do is hold your laser pointer in a very steady position, maybe 4 or 5 inches away from the charger. And once you have it in a steady position, you're then just going to hold down the on button so that the beam is going, and you're going to focus it more and more until you start seeing smoke coming up from the charger. And don't be worried that you're going to burn and destroy your charger, because you're not. You're just going to leave little tiny scratches on the charger. So what you're doing basically is steadying the laser, keeping it at one distance, holding it in the on position, and just focusing it more and more until you reach the point where it's burning the charger. And like I said, all it's really doing is leaving little tiny scratches on the charger. It's not destroying it really. And once you reach the best point where it's burning at its quickest from that distance, you can actually do something like carve your initials into the charger if you wanted to.
A lady is screaming all the names of the police and the federal agents.
We know where you're staying at. We know your fucking name. We know where you're staying at. We know your fucking name.
Deputy Director Klein said he doesn't have his officers wear name tags because they're being doxxed. That's exactly right. That's another thing that's absolutely disgusting. So they're not only jeopardizing the lives of the agents, but they're also jeopardizing the lives of their families as they're putting out their home information, and they're suggesting that individuals go to their homes. So yes, I, as the acting commissioner, have authorized and supported removing their names from their uniform. Instead, what we have, though, is a personal identifier. So we have that, so we can identify, and we have each identifier associated with a specific name, so we have all that information internally, and we'll share that with the appropriate entities when it's necessary. Our SRT teams, it's the same thing. right? Clearly identified. Different color uniform, clearly identified. So I hope that that puts to rest the lies and the false rumors about that they're not properly marked.
There are rules to follow. Deputy Fire Marshal Doug Nolan says to only use legal fireworks, which are ones that don't explode or fly into the air. He says if you get caught using illegal ones, it could cost you a fine between $500 to $2,500.
People were taping marbles and rocks to these explosives. People were taping marbles and rocks to these explosives.
Here they are. All right, watch out. All right.
Fuck the police.
What is it?
Fuck the police.
All right.
Fuck the police.
Say it. Can you do that? Everybody hear you,
Fuck the
all
police.
right. Power to the people. Power.
Make a lot of effort not to refer to what we're talking about here as protests, because protests and this are two different things. The Black Lives Matter movement is not violent. This story that we're going to talk about today is about a small group of agitators that is attempting to hijack that message and use it as a cover for criminal activity. I want to be clear as I frame this discussion here today that the city of Portland and the Portland Police Bureau support peaceful protests. We took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and that includes the First Amendment right to free speech and free expression and freedom of the press. The city of Portland and the Portland Police Bureau supports the idea that Black Lives Matter. But as I said, this message is being lost in a nightly scene of violence, property damage, and criminal activity that is completely inconsistent with this community's values. And we all need to work together to put a stop to what we've seen over the last several weeks. So I will start with a timeline of events, and I'll summarize some of the significant events, but I just ask that we keep in mind that we've seen this kind of criminal activity pretty much every night since about May 28th. And this all started on May 28th with a small demonstration at an ICE facility in Southwest Portland. And it wasn't a very large event, but one item of significance there is at that event, someone threw a Molotov cocktail into a wall of the building down there. But the really big ongoing event started on May 29th. What happened on May 29th is there was a mainstream protest event, and then this group split off from that later in the evening. This was a more violent episode of civil unrest than I have ever seen in my entire career in the Portland Police Bureau, and really than in living memory. We encountered widespread burglary, theft, property damage, and fires being set downtown, assaults on police officers. At one point, agitators broke windows and stormed the sheriff's office records section in this building on the 3rd Avenue side. There was a group of records employees working there at the time. The office was ransacked, and there were fires set in the office. We encountered extensive vandalism to the federal courthouse, and thus began the unprecedented situation that we still see 6 weeks later. So this is some video here at the Justice Center on May 29th. There's a fire inside the building. Earlier in the day, we would see really, really large peaceful protest groups often going on very large marches, sometimes over 10,000 people. And these events really didn't need a lot of police interaction. For some of those, we didn't even show up because there really wasn't a need for police. They were very well organized, and they didn't involve any kind of crimes or violence or anything like that. And the organizers were able to keep those events orderly and productive without us. So we took a hands-off approach to those events. But then there was a second group that after those events would show up down here and focus their energy on the Justice Center. Pretty early on, we noticed that it looked like the organizers of the larger legitimate protest events sort of distanced themselves from some of the elements that we are seeing more as agitators, and we got into just a cycle of nightly attacks on this building, on the Justice Center. Focused a lot of times on the fence around the building, and then the sheriff's office side of the Justice Center. The sheriff's office obviously had a lot of the windows broken out on their side and had to have staff out there to try to secure this building. This building houses the Multnomah County Detention Center, which has hundreds of adults in custody at any given time. There was an attempt to access the First and Jefferson parking garage where some city vehicles are stored. There's also a fueling station in there. At one point, we had to station a group of officers in there to try to keep people from accessing that because of the obvious danger of fire. People piling up objects and dumpsters in front of the garage door to keep the officers inside. Lots of use of fireworks. The violence ratcheted up, the setting of fires, more vandalizing of businesses, and what it looks like was really an attempt to escalate to the point where we had to come out to protect life and property in downtown Portland, and then our officers would be attacked. And then on June 25th, we had an attack on our North Precinct at Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Killingsworth. In this event, this is one scene of the building at North Precinct and some of the graffiti that was painted there. You can see a lot of references to killing police officers, headless pigs with police hats, those kind of things. This really sort of speaks for itself. And then a really disturbing development. Doors were barricaded shut, and here's just two examples of doors to the precinct that were barricaded shut. And you can see they used wood. They used screws. Our officers inside the building actually heard screws being driven into the wall with a drill to barricade these doors shut. And then, as you can see on the right, they set fire to the north side of the building, which contains some businesses, but that's all the same building. And we were very fortunate that that fire was interrupted before it caught that whole building on fire. That's a pretty old building with a lot of wood framing in it. And had this fire been able to take off with people barricaded inside the building, the results would have been catastrophic. One of the things that's important to note about this is that when the fire was set, it was actually set in a dumpster. It was on wheels, and then that dumpster was rolled up against the building to try to set it on fire. And again, you can see some of the sentiment that was painted on the walls of North Precinct. Once the group got to Lombard and Campbell, fires were set in rolling dumpsters again and rolled out into the street. We believe that the state police crowd control team likely prevented the PPA headquarters from being set on fire at this point. One of the things that was striking to me about this event was the volume of projectiles that the state police reported that were being thrown at them over a pretty long period of time. Some of the things that were thrown included softball-sized rocks, some of which hit police officers and state troopers, frozen water bottles again, glass bottles, full beer cans, marbles launched from slingshots. We had some officers, and as did the state police, injured by projectiles. There were lasers shined in officers and troopers' eyes. which involved some injuries. And the challenge in this area is a couple of things, one of which is fire, because this is a pretty old neighborhood. And I'll show you, we'll come back to this video here in a minute, but I'll show you, this is the location of this building in North Portland. And you can see the really close proximity of businesses and houses in this neighborhood. There's a residential neighborhood right up against the commercial properties that go along Lombard. These tend to be older wood framed houses. They're very close together. And the danger of fire here is pretty extreme. Red laser to get shine in officers' eyes at a couple of different points. This officer over here on the right may have happened already. Some of the Federal Protective Service officers that were trying to protect the federal courthouse. At one point, someone launched a mortar-style firework into the building. They actually got the doors open enough and launched a mortar inside the building. And at that point, evidently the Federal Protective Service deployed CS gas again to disperse the crowd. The crowd regrouped, began walking in streets downtown, threw fireworks and other objects at officers, again set fire, damaged property. We'll show you some video from that night. There's a few things that are, I think, that these videos help understand. We're going to talk about the role of fire in this type of events here in a little bit, but pay attention to the fires. You can see some really low-grade, like ground level fireworks going off over there. The green lasers, we're going to talk about those here in a minute. And these people are burning a flag that's up against the plywood on the 3rd Avenue side of the building, on the sheriff's office side. This is fairly early on in the event. See, it's a fairly large crowd here. There's a security camera up there. That's what all of the bright lights and green lasers are being focused on. See the reference to dead cops, burned pigs. So we are continuing to see this kind of activity. I wanted to just in the chronology give you some of the high points that we've seen so far. But again, activity like this has gone on almost every night since May 29th. So now I want to talk just a little bit about some of the, in broader terms, some of the tactics that we're seeing. We'll make this available as a PDF for you. This is not secret information here. We got this off the internet. This picture popped up a lot on social media and on the internet right as events began. I'm not sure exactly what the origin of this is. We're still working on trying to figure this out, but this is not our diagram. We got this off of the internet. And I won't read this to you because you can really see it yourself, but I want to point out a couple of the more noteworthy elements of this strategy here. These shield soldiers up here, these are the folks all the way up at the front line. Peaceful protesters, often by the organizers of this kind of thing, they'll try to get the people that just kind of show up to see what's going on, but they're not quite all in on throwing things and engaging in violence. They'll try and get them to go up towards the front. And I'm going to show you a video that illustrates a lot of this here in a minute. And then the light mages, those are the people with the laser pointers right there in blue. You'll see people with slingshots. Fire mage. I didn't make these terms up, and I don't know if this is what everyone calls these, but these are the people who throw flammable stuff and fireworks, all the way back to the communications people and some of the people who are trying to organize the group. What we have learned over the years about events like this is that agitators will come to events with other people who are into whatever's going on to varying degrees. And their objective is to use crowd dynamics really to get people to stop being individual identifiers and become collective identifiers, and then direct that energy against their objective, which in this case is usually the Justice Center. You'll hear a lot of times when we interview people who get arrested for crimes related to this kind of disorder that I don't know why I did that. I don't know what got into my head. I just got swept away in the moment. And that's really the objective here, is to try to generate that process. So this is some video. This is from June 11th, I believe. Whoops, helps to hit the right button. This is from June 11th, downtown Portland, right over here at First Avenue, and I think that's Madison Street. Excuse me, 2nd and Jefferson. So on the right-hand side are the people. You'll see this get organized fairly quickly, but the police are actually off to the right. I promise this gets more stable here in a minute. In a minute here, you're going to see everybody's hands go up almost at once, and you'll hear somebody yelling, hands up, because they're getting commands from the police officers, from the police down the street. And by this point, there's been projectiles launched and thrown at the officers. You'll see the people with umbrellas up in the front. It's very common. But the real action is going on behind this group of people with their hands up, and you're about to see that right now. See that guy telling everybody, get your hands up? So did you see the guy come from behind the line and throw that? That's that set of tactics in action right there. And then the objective as the police start moving is to try and get these people to stand there in the way as long as you can while all the people who were engaged in criminal activity get away. One of the reasons why we believe that the 3rd Avenue side of the Justice Center is often the focus of this is the park across the street gives sufficient depth of field for all of those layers to come together. And it's also a really ready source of supply from behind the line, if you will, on 4th Avenue. It's really easy to get a car down 4th Avenue, and we've seen where crowds have been supplied with things to throw at police officers and other items from 4th Avenue. And so that's not a new phenomenon. It's been like that for a long time, but that's one of the reasons why I think you see this happen so much on the sheriff's office side of the building. It's not necessarily that they're directing their energy at the sheriff's office. It's just it's a much better place to engage in tactics like this in terms of the environment. And then here, this shows some of the organization efforts. Again, trying to get that group of unconnected people to start thinking together and moving together in pursuit of whatever the objective is. And so what you're going to see here, this is on July 4th. This is after the Federal Protective Service has dispersed the crowd that was in the park after the attack on the courthouse. And the group is fairly disorganized, but just watch how people are trying to regroup this group of people so that they can get them back focused on that common objective. The chants are part of that, trying to get everybody together. They're calling for Shields to move up to the front. This group is not restricted from leaving this area at all. They can walk away behind the view of the camera all they want. They are not trapped in this area at this time. which is reorganizing themselves. So you see the umbrellas there. It's not raining. This happened. This was July 4th. And then in this video, you can see they're not quite able to get it all put together before they have to start moving again. But that's one of the challenges in policing things like this is a lot of times, if we allow that group to come back together, then we know that we're going to be facing more violence. But you really have to be careful as you're watching that crowd, and you have to be able to read that crowd really well and know that that's actually what's happening before you're going to take any kind of police action. I talked a little bit about the thrown objects that we're seeing. Some other things that we're seeing, they'll use a lot of like wrist rocket slingshots. We've got one that has actually, I think, been seized from this event that we can show you. Lieutenant Hughes is going to go get that. You'll see two-person slingshots that are supposed to be used to launch water balloons. They'll use those to launch rocks, bottles, other things. The agitators will use paint-filled balloons. We'll throw those at officers trying to hit their face shields on their helmets so that it renders the face shield unusable and the officer has to lift it up. Lots of just different things thrown or fired at officers with slingshots, sometimes at pretty high velocity. And then lasers as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in a minute. We have found some improvised incendiary devices cached outside some of these events and experienced a few of those. And then just a lot of fireworks, some of them very large. This is just a very small sampling of some of the items that you'll see at these things. There's one of the shields. This glass bottle over here, and this doesn't have cartridges on it, so I'm not sure how much use this face mask would be, but these came out of a backpack.
What's that on the left?
This is a shield. So it's half of like a 55-gallon plastic drum, and then they've drilled holes in it for ropes so they can hold it up and use it as a shield. And you can see that's this right here. Some of the equipment that folks have brought down here. Talk a little bit about the lasers. And pretty early on, we saw a shift from red lasers to green. We're going to talk about why that probably is here in a minute. But lasers have been shined in a lot of officers and state troopers' eyes. We've had a lot of eye injuries reported from this. And you can see on the left some laser operators in action. It's pretty common, and I'm not sure why this is, to kind of hide behind a sign while you're shining a laser. I think that may be partially because it makes it a little harder to identify the person. This is a crime right here, and you can see the intensity of this laser light, and we actually have one here. This is one of the green lasers that we've, if I can get it to work, you can see just the intensity level of that right there. Do that one more time? Yes. Wait for the shutters to stop clicking. And right there, this is an actual piece of equipment that was seized in one of these events. There's the warning label that says not to point this in people's eyes. Why green? Green lasers apparently are effective at much longer distances. They can actually seriously damage your eyes out to 52 feet. You looked at that earlier video from June 6th, those officers were maybe 50 or 60 feet from that line. And then they can flash blind someone out to 245 feet. And they're a distraction hazard, as you can see, almost to 11,000 feet. At some points, we have had these directed at aircraft from these events. I want to talk a little bit about fire, because this is important in crowd science. So the role of fire, the use of fire in these events is usually intentional. There's something about fire that can help shift the dynamics of a crowd. And if you look back at a lot of events, whatever kind, that go really bad, even like the celebrations after sporting events that deteriorate into riots, any kind of event that just deteriorates into civil disturbance, very often fires will get lit, and that is a turning point in the evolution of this event. The fire tends to do something to people, and again, the goal is to try and get people to stop individually identifying and start to coalesce as a group and become group identifiers. The fire has a really important role in that. This might have something to do with the almost nightly fires that we see lit in the fountain where the elk used to be, or when the elk was there, the fires on the elk. And again, it's all about getting this group to coalesce together and then directing it at an objective. These are often made from materials stolen from construction sites, plywood pried off of previously broken windows, or other materials that agitators are able to find in their environment. And then this is a picture of arson fires. This comes from the Fire Bureau. This is just from noon on May 29th to noon on June 8th. This map is probably a lot more populated by now, but that is not a normal volume of arson fires for a 10-day period in downtown Portland. The other problem with fire is, especially in older parts of the city where buildings tend to be made of wood and less fire resistant, it is extremely hazardous to the neighborhood, and it can spread quickly, especially when it's dry. Another thing that we're seeing a lot of is fireworks. I want to talk just a little bit about this. We've seen everything from small fireworks, like, you saw some of the ones like the fountain on the ground, all the way up to commercial grade fireworks display style mortars. This is an example of how those are being used. You can see the people with the shields there. They've thrown down some smoke. Officer comes out to try to address that. You can see an officer stomping out one firework that was thrown. This is on July 4th. You can see that went off pretty close to officers. That's another fairly common injury that we're seeing, is issues with hearing related to these going off in close proximity. This is another example of the same thing. This has become almost commonplace. And then talk a little bit about doxing. At one point during this event, when the fence was still up, there was somebody down there with a bullhorn reading off names and home, or at least what was purported to be home addresses of police officers. This is just one example of lots of stuff that's out there on the internet. Obviously, anything that comes out in tweets you take with a grain of salt, but this is just gives you an idea of the sentiment that's out there. And then this, I've redacted the addresses here. Not all of these are necessarily accurate. This is online right now. So you can see that there are attempts get names and addresses of police officers. This is why we made the switch away from name tags on police officers to personnel numbers to try to prevent this. Obviously, this has a pretty big impact on people's families. If you have children, this is not a super comfortable thing to have happen to you.